This is Nothing to Think About, an audiobook read by Philip Ballerscheff, written by Philip Ballerscheff. If you want to read along to the actual story, I've included a link in the description below. He had stood before the open door long enough to irritate her. "Come in, you're letting in flies," she said. That was no longer true. It was winter, and there was fly mesh on the door. She said it out of habit. The crickets of summer were gone too. "Shut the door," she said. "You're letting the good air out." He did as she asked, and locked the door, a habit he retained from the time living in cities. There was no one here to steal from them but animals. They had had a potted plant then, but had given that up for all the trees around them. Strangers passing through were recognized as such right away. She sneezed and told him he should have shut it before she asked. Now it was cold. Fetch tissues to make up for it. He did. She pressed the tissue to her wide nose and forgave him when she was done. "There's going to be a storm," she said. She prided herself on being able to tell the weather and other events by the goings-on of her body. She could feel it in her bones, and it could be a lot of things, and also many other places. Explanations, she felt, were unnecessary. She said a storm was coming, and it always did. Had she bothered about this mystery, she would have found some theory that sounded true enough for her to believe it, but she didn't. All she knew was that her bones ached before a storm, not how they were connected, but the pattern repeated so much and so faithfully that she took it as a sure sign. Her husband brought everything the wind could take inside their house, which wasn't much, but enough to fill the guest room. He had been out getting groceries and still had the bags at his side as he did what she asked. She lay on their sofa and wanted to stay there. He locked and unlocked the door each time he went in and out of the house. Instead of standing up, she raised herself just enough to lean on her elbow and told him to leave the door open instead of rattling with his keys. He did that. Then he hung the bags from his wrists so his hands could carry what lay in the yard. She watched him struggle to carry all that and told him to leave the bags in the kitchen the second time he came inside. Trying to help, she unpacked what he had bought, though she was so slow that he was done with his task before she was with hers. He helped her put away the last few items. She considered herself the head of the household, a small role since their only child was no longer under her roof. That left her husband, who obliged out of kindness, the way you'd help a stranger or even better, a child. She imagined she controlled him. He knew for a fact no one but him would save their things from the storm or do all else that needed to be done around here. He still doubted she could feel a storm coming. He had told her so some time ago and gave up arguing when she said nothing he could say would convince her. They called each other you instead of Emily and Bernard, or just asked for help, except when they were angry. Then they'd use their names as insults. At their angriest, they wouldn't speak to each other even when it inconvenienced them. She always relented before he did, because he had little to lose. They agreed to disagree on her predictions and on many other things. She was too stubborn to admit defeat and accepted a truce instead. He cared more for her approval than for being right and having others recognize it. She was fond of saying everyone had their talents, major and minor. Hers were prediction and taste. He didn't know what his were. She disliked fiction, though because she had fond memories of stories from childhood, she didn't dismiss it outright. It had its purpose, and she had outgrown it. She preferred fact, meaning biographies and books attempting to explain some aspect of the past, present, or future. With these books as her foundation, she developed wonderful-sounding theories which weren't the same as her predictions. When she felt a storm, it would come, even if someone forced her to lie. The signs were there. Her theories were what she thought would happen. This uncertainty is why she and Bernard could discuss them, why they were safe ground. They couldn't be disproven except by waiting for the future, by which time Emily forgot them all. Bernard knew better than to remind her. Her husband read fiction too, but she thought he read only that, no matter how many times he read a book she bought. She tried to explain their personalities with this difference, a smaller one than she imagined it to be, but failed. On any afternoon she had the time to, you could find her laying across her sofa like she did now, in a position her husband said it hurt him to look at, with such a book in hand. She wore little glasses her husband mistook for repurposed opera binoculars because of their gold-plated frames and other finery. Their lenses were as good as window glass, but she felt they helped her see small print. She wore flower print dresses whose colors she had preserved through her care. Those, Bernard felt, were more honestly ornamental. The people she read about served as models for her life. They were inspiring, all powerful in their own way, some because of the position they held and what they had done with it, others because of what they had done to get it. These ranged from mayors to chiefs of departments to leaders of countries big and small. There was no chance of her ever having their power. She strived to be like them in character instead. This meant mastering her husband like they had mastered their respective industries, fields, and countries. Another woman would have imagined how a biographer might write about her, but Emily knew it was no good to think about the ordinary. She felt love and hate and all the rest, yes, but towards uninteresting people for petty reasons. So did the people she read about, but they had their moments of greatness when their feelings and the deeds that those motivated affected hundreds of people or more. Everyone is human, she liked to say, and he hated to hear, but some become something more. This led her to waste time on questions she couldn't answer, and which weren't worth answering, like whether people were born great or had to nurture it. Good thoughts are dangerous in people who don't understand them for that reason. If it was nature, there was nothing you could do. If it was nurtured, the will to make use of what you're born with was part of your nature. She sorted through the subjects of these biographies by their talents, and would explain to herself, her half-listening husband, how similar this and that person were, and how they differed. He didn't see the point. They were all dead, and she was no nearer to greatness for learning about their lives. They avoided talking about their fights, as well as what caused them, her predictions, her taste, and his disbelief in both. He didn't have it in him to attack her. She wasn't ready to defend herself. As much as she read, there were hours and even days she couldn't think at all. As if I were drunk, she had once said in frustration. She never drank. She considered it a waste of her head and senses, and thought she didn't deserve to feel that way because of it. Bored, she provoked him with remarks both knew the purpose of, but which she could pretend were harmless. He even remarked on this from time to time, trying to be playful with his patience, telling her with a slap on the arm or the thigh that he knew what she was after and that she wouldn't get it, but sometimes she did. She would ask him what he was getting upset about, and as much as he tried to prove it, she seemed unable to understand. Really, she was only unwilling. At other times she did the opposite, taking offense where none had been intended, and none could be taken except deliberately. She made another announcement. To write a worthwhile autobiography, you need two talents, one for words and one for interesting deeds, whatever they may be. Few have both, which is why the biographer is as important as their subject. Her husband disagreed, so much that he even told her. If she wanted someone's story, why not get it from the source? Sure, they didn't have the nicest words, but who else knew their life like they did? Athletes aren't known for their introspection, quite the opposite, he began. She asked him if that was really the point he wanted to make. It wasn't. Anyone can imagine running fast, but few can do it. A biographer can only guess, he said, mashing his sentences together in his excitement, can only interview and reword what others say. The books she liked were second-hand autobiographies. He was proud of having made this point. You could see it in his face. She imagined him panting with the effort he needed. They exchanged more arguments, most not worth recording. What she now argued for was that biographies were worth anything at all. She went on without interruption, and then he spoke as politely as he had waited for her to finish. If she had to make this a contest, he said, reading the life and times of famous people told you nothing about why they were great. Biographies made an impossible promise and failed to deliver. Knowing they had failed, biographers hid this mistake among pages of details that didn't matter. Carnegie smoked cigarettes, or maybe cigars. His wife rushed to correct him. He spoke before he had thought of what to say. Yes, 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 to cut her off. I know you know. I don't. It doesn't matter. She told him he didn't know what he was saying. Worse, he did, and said it anyway. She left the room, postponing the argument forever. She had tried, failed, and gave up. They shouldn't have bothered. Differences of taste can't be resolved, and should be discussed instead of argued about. Her prediction came true. That consoled her. She took it as yet more evidence of her talents. Her husband knew she would, and saw that she had when she smiled, hearing the wind blow through their open window, and reading the memoirs of Rockefeller or maybe Carnegie. When the storm passed, he opened the door and, finding it had been a blizzard, got to work shoveling the road from their mailbox to their house. She made tea and set the table, a small return for all he did. When they were done, he took everything but the tablecloth. He took this arrangement calmly because he didn't expect her to do more and wasn't disappointed. He was talented at finding fault with himself to balance out what his wife did and make it seem like they were equally wrong and right. She had her delusions, maybe he did too. He worked, so did she, in her own way. This is how he kept an air of perfect calm, even when he felt differently. If you asked him, he would say he was being fair and sound like he believed that, but not enough to convince you. Sometimes she or he or something else entirely upset this balance, and he couldn't even convince himself that he was calm, let alone others. Afterwards, he apologized like he always did, either because he really thought he had been in the wrong, or because he thought it would be worse to prolong the conflict. Sometimes she apologized too, though only when her conscience made her, not now. These fights were so rare that they didn't strain their relationship much. They stayed together because of inertia and routine and because it wasn't that bad. His body had bloated with age. Hers had shrank, her skin now clinging to bone with barely any muscle between them. Who would have her now? Who would have him? He decided there were some things he shouldn't challenge her on. As for himself, he didn't care for all her opinions, but tolerated them as long as she wasn't hurtful. They established these boundaries through a series of arguments. He gave ground, but was always able to defend himself. She attacked and tired quickly. She went out to take a walk in the snow. He told her to take her coat along as she left, then hurried after her with it in hand. He stood right beside her, and yet she took it from him wordlessly. If she hadn't stepped aside to let him turn around, it would have been as if she didn't see him at all. She returned within the hour she had gone, her path obvious by the little boot prints she left from and then to their doorstep, her mood clear from her face, no longer tense. She had forgiven him, he hadn't forgiven her, and couldn't find anything in recent memory to balance out what she had done, as small as it was. He waited until she had draped herself over the sofa to go, and as he went, he stepped on his wife's boot prints and made them unrecognizable. He kept up his search until he was sure he couldn't find anything, then kept walking because that had never happened before. He began to think of other times he had looked for this balance. It had been his natural reaction to make peace however necessary, but now that he couldn't, he wondered why he'd tried. What had appeared to him before as a pattern of repeated incidents, somehow unconnected to each other, some avoidable, some not, now seemed part of her personality. He had tolerated, come to terms, and even laughed at it sometimes, but why should he? He couldn't find an answer for that either, but he didn't need to. He didn't need a deadline either. To say he'd leave her when the leaves fell, or less romantically, by next month, would just be putting it off. He knew what he wanted and would get it, with her help or despite her wishes. He laid all this out in front of her when he got home, repeating his question as if she hadn't heard him the first time. He enjoyed standing above her and watched her wait for him to go. She looked at him for a while, then looked away, counting the seconds but forgetting the number each time before she reached a minute. It was too dark now for her to escape the house again. She got up. He stepped aside so she could stand and then let her go to her room. All the while she expected him to stop her, but he didn't. Now he had a question for himself: what to do next? He was halfway through planning the divorce before he realized that she was the one who had to answer, not today, but tomorrow, not with what she said, but with what she did. She didn't respond in either way all morning. Not that she attacked him, but she didn't apologize. When she did finally say something that afternoon, it seemed as if nothing had happened between them. He would have to wait and see if she had changed within the week. He waited through the next few days to see if she would mention what he'd said, then asked himself if he should bring it up and decided against it. He studied her reaction. She didn't mention it, but was it because he had shocked her into silence and reflection, or did she treat what he said as nothing more than an outburst? When a week had passed since he had told her how she treated him, he fell back into planning. If she provoked him again, and he was sure she would, he'd tell her she had lost his respect for the last time. He imagined slapping her arm harder, like he had threatened to do to their child and never done, and wouldn't do to her this time. He so anticipated telling her this that he provoked her. "You've been awfully quiet," he said one day, sitting down next to her as she lay across their sofa, forcing her to pull her legs up. She said nothing, looked up to where the sound had come from, then went back to her book. "Nothing? Don't you have something to say? A fight to start? An apology to make?" Still nothing. He got up and left it at that. Should he go or not? Should he leave that up to her? He gave her time to respond. Maybe it hadn't been on her mind, though what else could she be thinking about? Even now, he had to restrain himself from apologizing to put an end to it all. The next day, he told her about his plans, those he'd decided against and the ones he'd put into action. This surprised her. She had given it much less thought than he had. This pleased him. He had given this decision a lot of thought, reasoning out what he stood to lose by telling her. As he expected, she pretended to be hurt and said he had tricked her. How or why, she didn't say. He waited patiently until she stopped. He no longer felt he needed to convince her. She knew what she was doing, and that he knew this. She wanted him to try and prove it, which is impossible with someone trying to misunderstand you. He pressed on with a part he hadn't rehearsed. "There's no one in this house but you and I, and the house is mine. If you don't quit this and apologize, you'll have to move." It was this threat that got to her. She hadn't considered divorce a real possibility, and even when she had, she didn't think of it as her being thrown out. She got up and went to her room, her anger obvious from how quickly she walked. He stayed on the sofa, shocked and proud that he had made that threat. Once he had gotten over himself, he went around the house and sorted their belongings into what was hers and what was his. They'd have lawyers to do this for them in earnest later, but it was good to get an idea of what separation would mean for them. He went to bed when he was done, thinking with excitement and fear of what was coming, if, that is, he let it come. By the time that was over, he was tired enough to sleep. The separation wasn't instant. He hadn't imagined it would be, but it was one thing to estimate how long it would take, another to feel time go slowly. even as he hurried the process along by helping her pack and finding her a house. He kept hoping for an apology all the while, and was glad he had asked for one. If he hadn't, he could have found a way to make their divorce his fault. He could hear himself already. How could she have known what he wanted if he didn't tell her? How could she know to apologize? Well, he had, and she hadn't yet. She did speak to him, but just to say what to pack in a particular box and how to put it in her car. She didn't make it harder than it legally had to be, and he thanked her for that, though she didn't help him either. He went to the courthouse to file the divorce petition, found their wedding certificates, presented the family court clerk with 2 copies of every form, and paid the filing fee. She let him drive her to the final hearing. There was no one to inform except the court and their lawyers. They had no children to divide. Who owned what was largely clear. The house was his, both had their own car. Their furniture was partly his, partly hers, and the rest belonged to both, though he and she wanted to keep some of it and give some away. They divided the rest of their shared property in the same way. She gave him what she didn't want, and he did the same. What did she need with his fiction? What did he want with her Carnegie? He said in reply, though he wouldn't mind if she left that there. She left, and he stayed, both with their heads held high. It was afternoon when she took the last of her things. As she shut the door, a feeling spread about the house. He began to understand that there was no one there but him, no one to talk to or to endure, no one for him to help, no one who would hinder him. What had seemed to take so long now seemed a short time for such a change. Change is difficult, even when beneficial. He first noticed what he missed, her company and all that entailed, and then what he had gained, silence, less work, and a house and life all his own. He stepped outside, leaving the door and windows open, so that wind could pass through. As full of thoughts as his mind was, the sound of the wind blowing cut them all down. Emily and her belongings were gone, yet he couldn't get rid of all of her. Names of famous figures she admired reminded him of the talents she had reduced them to, and of how she had made him feel small when discussing them. Still, as great as they might be, Carnegie and her other heroes didn't cast a shadow over everything. They could be ignored, he found, just by avoiding what they had made. There wasn't a Carnegie Hall or library anywhere near him, and the influence of the others was less concrete than that. They had tried to redeem themselves in different ways or not at all. He didn't know who had invented most of what he used, and Emily had never told him, meaning he couldn't be reminded of her that way. Soon, his memory of Emily was only her predictions and her talents. Even this form of her influence waned. It took months, but eventually he could read some of the biographies she had forgotten to take with her, and not think of her. All the rest, time spent with her and words exchanged between them, fell by the wayside long before this. Years from then, they found themselves back together in a nearby town. She visiting a friend, he on errands. Neither recognized the other. He had met a friend and laughed at the opinions and beliefs Emily had held so dear, then noticed the time and excused himself. He was embarrassed to see her, and also sure she knew who he was than she was herself. They had changed their styles. Age had changed them further. By now, she had long had to do without his help. She hadn't found another man like him to command. That hadn't bothered her until she had the kinds of problems she had always turned to Bernard to solve, those being everything she was too tired or slow to do. Once she had done all she could in one day, she couldn't muster herself to do any more. She left work until tomorrow, when it would have been easier to do it today. Snow came as it did every year. At first, she left it alone, knowing there was no one to shovel it for her, but pretending she could wait for it to melt or get a neighbor to help. How often did she go out or check her mailbox anyway? Not enough to shovel. It irritated her to be this way. What good were those biographies if her will was so weak? Her power over others turned into power over herself. She commanded herself to do what needed doing, just as Bernard had. She was too weak, and the road was too wide for her to shovel it all. Instead, she made a path from her doorstep to her mailbox large enough for her to walk on. First, she stuck the shovel right at the bottom of the snow pile, then realized that was too heavy for her and skimmed a bit off the top each time. The work exhausted her before she finished, but she went ahead anyway, though slower than she had begun. When done, she went back inside and shoveled more the next day and even more the next. There wasn't as much snow to shovel on the third day because she hadn't let it build up like before. She went at her other work, laundry, cleaning, groceries, and so on, in much the same way. She let Bernard speak before telling him this. Years ago, she wouldn't have shown weakness and didn't even know she was weak. He still knew who she was, but didn't feel so strongly about her that his face gave it away. It wasn't quite like meeting a new person, but with some work on his part, he could imagine it to be. He told her what he had done with his house and what friends he had made. She made a note of that subject and came back to it when she was done with her talk of shoveling. Hearing this, Bernard regretted the divorce and thought how nice she was to be around, then caught himself. Had he stayed, she would have stayed the same. He was surer of himself than he had been and had become independent in a different way than Emily. Her silence would have made him uncomfortable and set him to think what he had done to deserve it. Now he took it as how she felt, not something to fix. There was no question of them moving back in together. It was enough for them to be friends, better even to have this distance.